Yemen's Houthis have launched a missile attack on Israel's biggest airport, leaving at least 8 injured. The Iran-backed group that has claimed responsibility says the strike Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed a multi-phased response.
How Iran struck Israel, the shocking attack on Ben Gurion Airport. What you're watching here is the first explosion at Ben Gurion Airport in Israel, caused by a ballistic missile strike from the Houthi group. The explosion was so intense that it created an approximately 82-foot deep crater. The blast's shockwave was so powerful that it caused panic among passengers in the airport terminals, forcing them to flee and seek shelter. Before the explosion, at Ben Gurion Airport, another blast occurred at one of Iran's most vital ports, serving as a critical hub for its trade. The Rajai port in Bandar Abbas, located in southern Iran, handles 90% of the containers that enter the country, making it a key focal point in Iran's commerce. Let's move to the image, where we see a photo of the Iranian foreign minister and the American envoy to the Middle East, following the failure of their nuclear negotiations. After 3 rounds of talks on Iran's nuclear program, both sides were scheduled to meet for a 4th round in Rome to finalize the details they had negotiated. However, Iran abruptly announced that it would not continue the discussions. Let's review the sequence of events before moving on to what happened next. On April 26th, a targeted attack caused an explosion at Iran's most critical port. Then, on May 1, the US-Iran nuclear negotiations were postponed indefinitely, following an event that led to their collapse. Finally, on May 4th, Ben Gurion Airport in Israel was struck by a severe ballistic missile attack, with real missiles this time, unlike the empty shells Iran had launched previously. The sequence of events: an explosion in Iran, followed by the collapse of negotiations, and then an explosion in Israel. This sequence raises several vital questions. Who was responsible for the explosion at Bandar Abbas port? What is the connection between the explosion and the shipment of ballistic missile fuel that arrived at the port from China just moments before the blast? Why did the missile fuel shipment explode? Is there a connection between the explosion and the collapse of the nuclear negotiations between Iran and the US? Did the negotiations fail permanently, or is there a possibility they will resume? It has been reported that US President Trump dismissed National Security Advisor Michael Waltz upon learning that Waltz had covertly collaborated with Israel to plan an airstrike on Iranian nuclear facilities. Upon discovering this, Trump promptly removed Waltz from his position. Is there a connection between these behind-the-scenes actions and the failure of the negotiations and the explosions? How did the Houthi group manage to strike Ben Gurion Airport with ballistic missiles despite Israel's advanced air defense systems? Israel boasts robust air defense systems such as the Iron Dome, THAAD, and Patriot, which should provide more than adequate protection for the airport. Ben Gurion is not just any facility. It is one of Israel's most critical infrastructure points, heavily fortified with the highest level of security. So, why did these systems fail to intercept the attack? How can a hypersonic ballistic missile, which is designed to have an error margin of only a few yards, miss its target and land hundreds of yards away from Ben Gurion Airport? This failure led to a complete disruption of Ben Gurion Airport. However, air traffic did not cease. While international airlines suspended their flights, local national carriers continued to operate. This unexpected development led to a surprising outcome for Israel. The stock prices of Israeli airlines rose by 7% on the stock market. Usually, when a missile strikes Israel, its economy should be impacted, right? And when its airports are attacked, stock prices should decline, correct? However, when the Houthi missile struck Ben Gurion Airport, the opposite occurred. While foreign airlines, including American carriers, suspended their flights, air traffic at the airport continued as usual. Most passengers thought, as long as air traffic still operates, everything is fine. We want to continue our travels. With international airlines cancelling their flights, passengers had no choice but to board Israeli carriers like El Al, Arkia, and Israir, as they were the only ones still operating. As a result, Israeli airlines generated profits far beyond what they would have on regular days, and consequently, their stock prices surged. Now, the question you need to ask yourself is, how did Israel take the risk and continue operating flights, despite Ben Gurion Airport being targeted by missiles? Did Israel know that no additional missiles would strike? Were they aware that the missile that hit the airport didn't strike it but landed hundreds of meters away? The missile landed in an empty area, and although it was armed with a highly explosive warhead, it fell far from the critical infrastructure, similar to other Iranian missile strikes. This is the critical question we need to discuss. Let me explain what happened in the Iranian nuclear negotiations and what caused them to fail. When the negotiations began, Iran set forth a series of conditions, while the US also presented its own counter-conditions. We covered these conditions in the episode, Did Iran Just Build the Bomb? The Hidden Nuclear Truth Behind the Middle East Crisis. Feel free to watch it if you'd like to learn more about how the talk started under US President Trump. The negotiations proceeded through 3 rounds, with significant progress made and most issues resolved, until a major problem surfaced. The major issue arose when Steve Witkoff, Trump's Middle East envoy, entered the 3rd round of negotiations and told Iran, either you accept the deal or we will address Iran's missile program. From the outset of the talks, Iran had made it clear that its missile program was off the table, as it represented a red line for them. This program was crucial to their nuclear ambitions, as Iran required advanced ballistic missiles to carry nuclear warheads. When the US envoy raised the issue of Iran's missile program, Iran's foreign minister withdrew from the talks for 2 hours, retreating to a separate room away from the American negotiators. Subsequently, Oman's foreign minister, Badr bin Hamad al-Busaidi, intervened and convinced Witkoff to focus on finalizing the nuclear agreement, with the missile program to be addressed separately. Witkoff was persuaded and returned to the EO negotiating table with Iran's foreign minister. At this point, the negotiations had not yet collapsed. However, what followed was the imposition of new US economic sanctions on 7 Iranian companies involved in exporting Iranian oil. 4 companies were based in the UAE, 1 in Turkey, and the rest in Iran. The key takeaway is that Iran's response to your foreign minister's withdrawal from the negotiation rounds was significant. It wasn't just a simple withdrawal. It was, in effect, a wake-up call to Iran. However, the real surprise came from Iran's reaction. It didn't remain silent. Instead, it retaliated by launching a highly explosive ballistic missile at Ben Gurion Airport. Although the Houthis fired the missile, it's crucial to remember that the Houthis are essentially Iran's military arm, and they cannot launch a single shot without Iran's approval. Now, you must consider key details before we explore the new conditions the US imposed on Iran and the demands Iran placed on the US, as these conditions have clashed significantly. The key detail is that Iran possesses one of the most advanced missile systems in the world. Their expertise in missile technology is undeniable, and this is no exaggeration. The range, destructive power, and accuracy of their missiles are remarkable. There is little that rivals them. A prime example of this missile capability is their ballistic missile strike on Israel in October 2024. Iran successfully penetrated Israeli airspace with over 250 missiles, along with guided drones, Emir. This attack didn't just breach Israel's air defenses, it also bypassed American defenses. Among the targets struck were Israeli air bases. However, as we later learned, the missiles were empty, containing no warheads. Iran's objective wasn't to inflict physical damage, but to intimidate Israel, sending a clear message: I can penetrate your air defenses. The key takeaway from this missile attack is that it showcased Iran's ability to strike its targets with remarkable precision. The missiles hit their intended targets with impressive accuracy, directly hitting the core of Israeli air bases. So, when we observe Iran's strike on Ben Gurion Airport today, where the missile landed hundreds of yards away from the airport, not directly within the airport grounds, and did not disrupt air traffic, we must recognize that Iran, via the Houthis, deliberately avoided targeting the main terminal. This strike served as a warning, a pointed message from Iran. But why was this message so forceful this time, despite the missile landing far from the airport? For the first time, Iran struck Israel with a missile that contained a warhead filled with highly explosive material. The missile caused a massive explosion, creating a crater about 82 feet deep, indicating that it carried between 440 and 660 pounds of explosives, far more than usual. This was a significant amount of explosives, which is uncommon for Iran. While Iran equipped the missile with explosives, they intentionally targeted an area away from the critical infrastructure of the airport to avoid civilian casualties. Here's a crucial question. How did Israel's and even the US's air defense systems fail to intercept the Houthi missiles? Let me explain. You need to understand that no air defense system can provide 100% security over its airspace. This doesn't exist. Need proof? Look at Russia, which is widely regarded as one of the strongest countries in terms of air defense systems. If you were looking for a robust air defense, Russia would be the clear choice, with its possession of the S-400 system and the ongoing development of the S-500, two of the most advanced defense systems in the world. However, despite Russia's expertise in manufacturing air defense systems and its possession of one of the most complex air defense networks globally, the Ukrainian military launched the largest drone attack on Russian territory in March. The assault involved 337 drones, 91 of which reached Moscow, the Russian capital. The attack resulted in the deaths of 3 Russian citizens, 18 others being injured, and several buildings being destroyed. So, the question is, how did this happen? In Russia, how did Russian air defenses allow these drones to bypass them? Let me explain. The mechanism behind air defense systems is based on something called learning and adjustment. The engineers program the system to account for all possible scenarios. The system adapts to detection range, missile flight paths, maneuverability, jamming capabilities, and target acquisition. However, the attacking party, whether using missiles or drones, adjusts its strategies to bypass these modifications made to the defense system. When an attack occurs, the air defense system intercepts missiles based on their pre-programmed flight patterns, maneuvers, altitude, trajectory, and jamming techniques. But at the same time, some missiles manage to bypass the system's defenses. So, what happens next? Do we discard the air defense system? Of course not. The engineers review the flight paths of the missiles that managed to breach the defense, analyze why the system failed to intercept them, and then make adjustments to improve the system's ability to handle those types of missiles in the future. This process continues after each attack, and that's when you realize no air defense system can offer 100% protection over its airspace. It's essential to understand and accept this reality. Now that we understand how air defense systems work and how missiles can penetrate them, let's move on to the next point. The purpose behind these explosions is to apply pressure on all parties involved in the nuclear negotiations. So, what led to the failure of the negotiations? What went wrong? As we discussed in the "Did Iran Just Build the Bomb" episode, Iran has successfully enriched enough uranium to build a nuclear bomb. Consequently, Iran entered the negotiations with a strong resolve. When the US terms did not align with Iran's expectations, Iran set its own conditions, insisting they must be met. So, what are Iran's conditions and what are the US's conditions? US imposed 6 conditions on Iran. The first was that Iran must immediately and fully halt all uranium enrichment activities. If Iran wished to obtain uranium for peaceful nuclear energy purposes, the US insisted that Iran purchase enriched uranium from abroad, rather than producing it domestically. This is where Russia stepped in, offering to supply Iran with enriched uranium for peaceful purposes. The second condition was that Iran must allow American inspectors to oversee its nuclear facilities. It's important to note that the US did not propose inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, but demanded that American inspectors monitor the facilities. This is a crucial detail, as it meant the US was openly stating that its intelligence officers would be responsible for inspecting Iran's nuclear reactors, making the situation unmistakably clear. The third condition was that Iran must dismantle its ballistic missile program, capable of carrying nuclear warheads. This condition was a primary factor in the collapse of the negotiations. The fourth condition required Iran to hand over any enriched uranium with an enrichment level above 3.66%, the internationally accepted limit for peaceful use. As you may know, Iran has reached an enrichment level of 60%, which serves as clear evidence that when Iran claims to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes, it is not being truthful. If Iran were truly enriching uranium for peaceful purposes, it wouldn't need to go beyond the 3.66% threshold. The fifth condition was that the new nuclear agreement should have no time limit, making it open-ended. Iran could not later assert, "The deal is over, and I will resume uranium enrichment." No, this agreement would remain in effect indefinitely, with Iran being permanently bound by it. The sixth condition, which Iran accepted, was that American companies would manage investments in Iran's nuclear energy sector. In other words, if Iran sought to build new nuclear reactors, American companies would be responsible for constructing them. Iran agreed to this condition and announced plans to build 19 new nuclear power plants for peaceful energy purposes. While there is no issue with American companies building these plants, this will only proceed if the US agrees to Iran's terms. Let's take a closer look at Iran's conditions. Iran entered these negotiations with strong determination. And here's the surprising part. They sought to impose 10 conditions on the US and even threatened to walk away from the talks. Can you imagine? So, what's the first condition? Iran stated that it would not hand over its enriched uranium to the US. Instead, it would retain control of it. If the US withdrew from the agreement, as Trump did in 2018, Iran would have the right to resume uranium enrichment starting from the 60% level it had previously reached. So, did the US agree to this? No, they did not. The second condition was that the US must fully and immediately lift all sanctions on Iran. Did the US agree? Instead, they imposed new sanctions on 7 Iranian companies involved in selling Iranian oil. The third condition was that the US should face penalties if it violated any part of the agreement. In other words, Iran sought to impose economic sanctions on the US if it broke the deal, which the US rejected. The fourth condition was that the US should compensate Iran for all financial losses incurred due to Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear deal in 2018. Iran wanted the US to pay retroactive fines. For example, Iran could claim, "One day's loss cost me $1 million. Calculate my total losses from 2018 to today and pay me the amount." The US rejected this as well. The fifth condition was the release of all Iranian bank assets frozen abroad. The sixth condition was to allow international banks to conduct business with Iran. And the seventh condition was that the US would mediate with European Union countries to lift the sanctions imposed on Iran. The eighth condition was to cease all hostile actions by the US against Iran, whether military, economic, political, or even media-related. The mere fact that American media channels criticize Iran was unacceptable to Iran. And of course, the US rejected this. The ninth condition was that the agreement should allow Iran to reactivate its nuclear program if the US violated any part of the deal. The 10th and final condition was that the US provide Iran with a guarantee that it would not violate the agreement again, as it did in 2018. The US rejected this condition as well. Given the US's rejection of all these conditions, Iran withdrew from the negotiations, stating it would no longer engage in talks. However, the more concerning development came when the US and Israel attempted to pressure Iran by bombing a shipment of missile fuel at Bandar Abbas port. In response, Iran launched a missile strike on Ben Gurion Airport. Although the missile didn't cause significant damage, it marked the first time Iran targeted Ben Gurion Airport with a real missile, rather than a dummy one. So, what does all this mean? This means that Iran has become stronger, as demonstrated, by its refusal to back down or make concessions during negotiations. This could imply two things. Iran is making a dangerous miscalculation and will eventually face consequences, or it possesses a deterrent weapon, explaining its confident stance in negotiations. As for Israel, it stands to gain the most from the Houthi missile strike on Ben Gurion. Why? Because after a disagreement between Trump and Netanyahu at the White House, where Trump told Netanyahu that there would be no strike on Iran and no extended war in Gaza, Netanyahu needed a justification for action. That's when the Houthis provided the opportunity. In this complex situation, Netanyahu now has the right to retaliate against the Houthis in Yemen and also target the Iranian regime in Tehran, as Iran is the primary supplier and facilitator of the Houthis group. Netanyahu has openly stated that he would strike Iran, as it is the one controlling the Houthis. But how could Netanyahu strike Iran, knowing they have deterrence capabilities? The answer comes from US media itself, which reported that the primary reason for Trump's animosity toward Netanyahu was that Netanyahu wanted to confront Iran to the last American soldier, pursuing his own regional ambitions at the expense of the US military. So, here is the question for you. What will happen if Israel escalates its actions against Iran, and how will other global powers respond? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you found this episode insightful, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive. Until then, stay informed, stay sharp. This is Geopolitical Deep Dive.